Good evening, everybody. We're going to go ahead and get started. So for tonight, we are excited that this is our last public meeting regarding our surplus property strategy. We will be collecting all materials and all feedback that we receive and presenting that to our board this April. Before we really get started in tonight's agenda, there's also translation services available. On your screen or on your phone, you will see a CC option, which will provide translation into Spanish. So if you're in need of Spanish translation, you can use that function. Tonight, we don't have any materials to pass out because we're virtual, but at the end of this presentation, there is a QR code that we hope you will submit a survey giving us your feedback for yourself and the neighborhood that you live in, and all of that information will be captured by NOLA Public Schools. Tonight, we're really going to focus on reviewing our surplus property strategy and all of the next steps associated with it. We're coming to community pretty early in this process to review a potential strategy for how we deal with surplus property. We won't be talking about any one specific property this evening. And so hoping to get feedback on that generalized strategy before we begin to apply it to school buildings. And at the end of this session, we will be taking question and answer. We ask that you use the Q&A option to submit your questions. And at the end of the presentation, we'll go through all those questions and answer to the best of our ability. So our surplus strategy should do a few key things. First, we want to make sure that it is a transparent and well understood decision-making framework for how the school board makes decisions about vacant property that are no longer needed for educational use. The unique piece of this strategy is that we're not also talking about how we lease or sell our property in the future, but really how we transform those properties into community benefits and assets. That's really important to us as we have a lot of vacant property already, and we're going to have more in the future to make sure that these buildings continue to serve the communities that they're in. We'll also consider what those community benefits could be for certain properties and what your feedback on that is. And the end of the strategy, at the end of the day, should really reflect community engagement and the things that we've heard through these 4 community meetings. So first, I want to talk about why this strategy is even needed in the first place. Currently, the district already has a lot of vacant property. And for our native New Orleanians or folks that have lived here for a long time, you know that we have a lot of property that we've had vacant ever since Hurricane Katrina. So we have to build a strategy for what we already have as vacant. Currently, we have 13 vacant buildings and swing space properties, over 122 acres of vacant land, and the district currently spends about $770,000 on maintaining these properties annually. So we already have a large vacant property issue that we need to deal with more equitably, and we also anticipate that this property problem will grow in the future. And there are 2 real big factors that are determining how large our vacant properties may grow in the future. The first is declining enrollment. We are experiencing declining enrollment in our city and our state and our nation. In last school year alone, we saw a 16% drop in our kindergarten class. And again, this is a state and national trend. Because our enrollment is currently dropping and we anticipate that to continue, we need fewer school facilities in the future. The second main factor that's going to increase our number of vacant properties is we have a lot of high need facilities. And by high need means that they're going to require a lot of money to make sure that they're properly invested in. So our long-term facility needs are greater than the tax dollars we receive to invest in our buildings. So we need to find productive ways or productive community uses for how our highest need facilities can be repurposed into community assets. And just a little data to support those 2 statements. This table here on the left is an overview of how we've seen enrollment drop, not only in our parish, but in other urban parishes in the state. So we see the drop in enrollment over the last 5 years in K-12 and also just our lower grades, K-5. You can see that many of the parishes around us are experiencing really significant changes just in the last 5 years, especially in our youngest grades. And why is this happening? It's partially because of the changing birth rates. The birth rates in our parishes are also going down substantially. When children are born, aren't born, we don't see them 5 years later in kindergarten. Not only is this a Louisiana problem, but it's also a national trend. On the right side of the slide, you can see different mid-sized urban cities with other changes in their enrollment. Austin is currently having a 10% drop in their enrollment, Nashville 8%. New Orleans is at the lower end of this trend, mostly because we think we received a bit of an in-migration to the city after Hurricane Katrina. So this trend is happening to us as well, but it's happening a little bit later. And this graph shows an overview of our school buildings and their general quality. Every little bullet here or dot on this graph represents a school owned by the district. On the y-axis or on the far left, it's the amount of money needed to invest in those properties per square foot to make them high quality buildings. The schools that are the green dots and the blue dots are the schools that have the lowest need for capital for financing over the next 2 years to make sure the buildings are high quality, because those represent the buildings that were either newly constructed or fully renovated post Hurricane Katrina with the FEMA dollars the district received. Our tier 4 buildings are our lowest quality buildings or have the highest monetary need to make them high quality buildings. So they have high expenses to renovate and do construction projects. These tier 4 schools only represent 19 school buildings, but they represent over 60% of the district's total cost for facility repair needs. So very high need buildings. So all those factors together mean that we're likely only going to have more surplus property or vacant property in the future. And so we really need a strong strategy that really communicates what are we going to do with school buildings that are no longer needed for educational purposes. So tonight we're going to talk about a lot of those criteria that we'll be looking at to help decide what do we do with vacant or unneeded property long term. But I do want to stress that tonight's strategy is only for vacant and unneeded facilities. It's not a set of criteria for when we decide to make a building vacant, only what we do with it once it is. We also want that this decision-making process is community informed, and it helps us make the best decisions of what to do in buildings in every community. This strategy will also define our priorities when we have vacant property, priorities on repurposing buildings for community uses and through long-term leasing and other opportunities. This is a citywide map of all of the district's current vacant properties and vacant lands. The schools or buildings with the little red dot with a house inside represents a vacant property. The green dot with a tree inside represents vacant land. So you can see that we have several all across the city. We've talked with a lot of people before we've presented the strategy to community. We've talked with a lot of fair housing advocates, affordable housing advocates, redevelopment, the city of New Orleans. We've had to speak with some lawyers to understand what we can and cannot do given our public status, and lots of different organizations that have helped us think through this issue. Whenever the district has vacant property that we want to do something with, we really only have 4 options available to us legally. The first is to keep the property. We can choose to keep any vacant property we have and use it for swing space, which is what we use. We want to always have some just vacant swing space available for any school that experiences an emergency. We live in a city and a community facing climate change. Our natural disasters are stronger, and we always need a place to move students to after any kind of individual or citywide disaster so we can continue their education. Also, we could keep any property for short-term tenants, leasing that property for short-term periods of time for any mission-aligned organization so that we activate any vacant property and it just doesn't sit empty for community and potentially blight. The second option is we can swap any property with any other government entity. We have a lot of land and we have a lot of vacant properties, but it's not always where we might want it. We might want land that's closer to some of our current and existing schools to make sure they have all the green space that they can have. And so we might want to swap property we have somewhere else for property that is desirable for the district, and that's available to us. The third option is leasing property, which we've talked a little bit about already. We can follow a procurement process and lease property short-term or long-term for any community benefit that we want to see. And we'll talk more about what those community benefits might be and what might require a short-term versus a long-term lease. And lastly, and the option we are not prioritizing in this strategy is selling property. We do have the ability to sell property to any private entity at fair market value or higher, but we are exploring that if we ever did use this option, how can we put deed restrictions into that sale to really continue to control how that property is developed in the future. So those are the things we can do. We want to talk about the criteria or the things we look for to help us decide what to do. So the first step we always have to ask ourselves with any vacant property is, should we keep it? And if so, why? So the question that we really care about for keeping property is the property appropriate for future educational use? Though we have enrollment declining today, we don't know what the future holds. And once you sell your property, it's next to impossible to get it back. And we're aware of that. So when we think about could a building be a good fit for future educational use, we look at a few things. We want the building to be able to support no less than 350 students. Ideally, the building fits more, 500 students or more, but minimum, it needs to be big enough to have a financially sustainable school inside of it. Next, we think about the site size that the campus is on, so the entire space of the land. Ideally, we would want at least 3.5 acres of land that building sits on. That makes sure that we have ample property and available space for parking, bus drop-off and pickup spaces, green spaces, recreational spaces, building of athletic spaces. So ideally 3.5 acres, but we also understand that we are in a densely populated urban environment, and that might not always be possible, even in most neighborhoods in the city. And so really a minimum of 2 acres or more. Again, we are a city facing climate change and crisis from natural disasters, and we have to think about the sustainability of any piece of land or property. Does this piece of land or property flood often? Are the other environmental factors that we need to think about? So what is the sustainability metric we're looking at? And we are in a very old historic city, and there's going to be unique characteristics about some buildings that we can never get back or we can never have anywhere else. So any building that has unique geographic characteristics would be a property we may be interested in keeping, because that uniqueness is something we can just never get back. So if we keep a school, what do we do with it? So if we keep a building that's vacant for future purposes, what are we going to do in the short term to make sure it's not blight for community? And so in all cases, we don't plan on selling property that meets any of those criteria that we talked about in the previous slide. To keep property, we can do a couple things to it. We can use it as emergency swing space and keep it maintained and keep it around for whenever we have emergency needs, which unfortunately is often in our city. Or we can also use short-term leasing to mission-aligned organizations to activate that property. So while we're still figuring out what our needs may be in the future, that property is serving someone who is mission-aligned, providing services to our students and staff and families. And the other option that we can do, which is a little bit longer term, is we can lease the property long term for some redevelopment that doesn't lose its ability to be a school in the future. And so that's an option that's a little bit longer term, but we don't lose the property if we do that. And if we don't think a building has the ability to serve an educational purpose in the future, then what? So we know we don't want to keep a school or keep a building. What do we do then? And that's when we will look to longer term or permanent changes of use for that property. Again, we can swap those properties with other state or city entities, any public entity, to get something else that we want somewhere else. We've had a couple examples of this with the city of New Orleans over the past few years. Again, though we're not prioritizing it, we could sell the property to generate revenue for our other schools or other beneficial uses. And again, another long-term option for something when we don't think we need to keep a property any longer is we can lease the property long-term for a community benefit. And we're going to talk through what those community benefits might be. So we do really want to prioritize that whenever we are repurposing facilities, we are doing it in a way that benefits the community that that building is in or that land is in. We are also prioritizing that it must have a benefit or be related to our mission and purpose, or provide a public benefit. The things that will decide where we put various community benefits are really about what does our community want to see in that specific area. Community input for any long-term repurposing of a building or land is going to be incredibly fundamental to this strategy moving forward. That's when we would have individual meetings about the repurposement of any one property, and that would proceed before any proposals are accepted or requested or any advertisements for potential reuse of a property. So we want to come to individual communities, talk about individual properties before we define what that community benefit that we want to go after is. Different kinds of benefits have different timelines of commitments. If we want to change a building into affordable housing, that's a long-term commitment with a lease of no less than 40 years, because there's a lot of redevelopment that is needed, a lot of renovation that is needed. Typically tax credits and other avenues are being found to make the financing work. And so we want to make sure that to get the full benefit, we need to do some long-term leasing for some. For some community benefits, a short-term lease might be fine. An example of that might be turning a building into an early childhood space. Early childhood programming and school programming look pretty similar, and it doesn't really change a whole lot the purpose of the building. And so that could be one shorter term repurposing of a building. And the last thing is going to define things is what is that property best suited for? The size, the location, the type of facility it is will really determine what's possible. Some examples of that is if it's a really, really small building, you probably can't turn it into affordable housing because you're not going to be able to get many units out of it. Another example is if we want to turn a school building into early childhood, but there's not a lot of first floor space, that might not make a lot of sense for early childhood because you got to put the littlest kids on the first floor for lots of code compliance issues. I do see we have one question in the Q&A section. Please continue to put all of your questions in there. When we finish the presentation, we'll go through all of the questions submitted. So please use that Q&A function as you think of questions throughout the presentation. So this is a list of the community benefits or the ways we hope to change some of our vacant school buildings for these purposes. This is from a lot of feedback that we've already received. Really interested in your thoughts on these prioritized ways of repurposing buildings. One priority is to change buildings to make sure that they are serving some kind of educational component. So how do we use short-term leasing to ensure that we're providing land or providing property to any mission-aligned organization? That could be a nonprofit. It could be any city or state agency or other local nonprofits that provide services to our students and families, and providing them space at some low cost way to make sure that we are also prioritizing those services by creating a place for them to be. We've talked a lot about affordable housing. There are lots of different types of affordable housing. We have had issues with teacher recruitment in our city, and so we're very interested in turning properties into teacher housing, as well as family housing and other types of affordable housing options. Early childhood education is a desperate need in our city, and there is funding to provide more seats to more students in our city, but we need the space to do it. A recent millage was passed that provides funding for 1,000 more educational seats, early education seats, but we need the physical space to have them. And we hope the repurposing of some of our school buildings can do that. We have a lot of other priorities here, but I do want to talk about one, which is green infrastructure, because we do have a lot of vacant land. And we see green infrastructure projects as ways we can repurpose some of our land. turning vacant land into stormwater management so that we are using our vacant property to absorb water in neighborhoods that commonly flood, to make sure that we are helping our neighbors. Also solar projects, doing brownfield solar projects to provide access to low cost renewable energy. There are lots of projects that we can do with just our land to make sure that we are benefiting those around us. So how would this all work? What is the process we would use and what are the steps? So step one of this flow chart is kind of where we are currently. It's the process we currently have. Numbers 2 through 5 are new and what is part of our newly proposed strategy. Anytime any property becomes available to repurpose or for some other use, it must be declared surplus by our school board through their vote. So anytime we have a vacant property that we want to do something new with, we will need to ask our board to approve the surplus of those buildings or properties and follow all of the processes that are currently already in our policies. What is new is once we have a vacant property, we want to review those criteria that we talked about at the beginning of the presentation to help us decide, do we keep it long-term, but maybe repurpose it just for a short amount of time? Do we want to do a long-term reinvestment or repurposing, or do we want to sell the building? And so we need to apply those criteria to the specific property and come up with a determination based on the decision-making framework we're proposing. And then once we've done that and thought about what are the available options, coming to community, the specific community that property is in, and having community meetings to get advice, thoughts, and feedback on those potential options. And that community feedback would inform the types of advertisements and solicitations for redevelopment that we would request. And number 5 is we have to work with partners to get those unique things done. We are not affordable housing experts. We are not early childhood space planners. And so we want to make sure that we work with appropriate partners once we identify what community wants and we put those solicitations together. And the last thing we want to do is make sure that we're giving healthy expectations, because these things take time. To find a partner, to find somebody to redevelop a property and to actually get it done is going to be a 2 to 3 year timeline, depending on the size of the project. So this is the process we're proposing based on tonight's strategy. So we're going to go through a few examples of what some of these community benefits could look like and maybe already look like in our city. So the first is affordable housing. We know, again, that affordable housing is critical for our families, teachers, and our employees. Declining enrollment is affecting our entire district, but we know also part of the reason our enrollment is also declining is that our city is becoming more and more expensive to live in, and we're losing affordable housing, which means we were potentially losing our families to other cities and other communities. And so the repurposing of our buildings for affordable housing could help solve some of those challenges. And this is a picture of the current McDonough 7 facility that we are currently working with a swap for HANO, or the Housing Authority of New Orleans, to turn it into affordable housing. So this is currently underway and would be an example of a long-term commitment or a long-term transition of a property. Another example is early childhood education. We've talked about that a lot, but it's a desperate need of our city, because not only do we need more early childhood education in our city, but it helps our students come more prepared for K-12 school. And so how do we support the need for an additional 1,000 seats of early childhood space? And we hope our school buildings that we no longer need for K-12 education could provide that. That's a short-term commitment on our reuse of the building, because a lot of these are already built for educational purposes, but some properties may need some investment. And again, our revenue potential on these things is low. We're not trying to make money on these interactions. We're really just trying to make sure that we are using our buildings for some purpose that benefits our city. So we're almost done here, so keep thinking of those questions. I see a couple of questions in the Q&A so far, so please put whatever questions you have in there and we'll be happy to answer them. The overall kind of next steps for this process is to continue to collect community input on the priorities and the community benefits we've discussed here tonight. Our goal is to present all of that feedback at our April school board meeting. And we will also be providing additional feedback opportunities. Tonight, you'll look at a QR code for a survey, but we also have the same survey available on our website, and that will stay available on our website until the end of March. So if you want to think about your feedback for a little while, you'll have about 2 weeks of opportunity to provide additional feedback. Once we amend our strategy based on feedback and present it to our board, it will be our board's job to adopt a final strategy and to pick our first properties for potential reuse. Again, for any long-term commitment for reuse of a property, we are committing to come to the individual communities that that property is in to get feedback on the specific community benefit that community wants to see in that building or that land, and that community meeting process will begin before any solicitations or advertisements for redevelopment are issued. And so that's it of the strategy. We really do want to hear from you. We want to understand what your top priorities for reuse for any vacant property could be in your neighborhood, and also what you might like to see citywide. Is there some kind of need in our city that we did not discuss tonight that you think we should be addressing with the reuse of these properties? What else did we not consider that you didn't see in this presentation but you think is important? We really hope that you provide that information to us. If you open up your camera on your phone and scan this QR code, it will take you directly to our survey. Also, our survey is available on our website at the link here below. Also at this link is a list of all of the district's current vacant property and this presentation. And again, this feedback opportunity will be open until the end of the month. So now I'm going to open up the Q&A to see what kind of questions we have. I see one question about, it's kind of a question, but about Audubon Gentilly. There's been some issues with the green space that's associated with that campus in Gentilly. And unfortunately, part of that land is owned by the city of New Orleans, and part of that property is owned by Orleans Parish School Board. And we're working to find a compromise to ensure that school has green space. Somebody asking about if the presentation is available. It is available on our website. One question, there are 10 arts and education nonprofits who are looking for space and currently working in the art space. Seems like one of these schools could be a perfect fit for collaboration there. How do partners approach you with ideas? I think that's a great comment and a great idea. What we hope to be doing is, as we begin to start community meetings about any individual property, is to really not only advertise that to the individual community that property is in, but also any agency or group that has told us of interest. So for anybody who's interested in seeing how can my nonprofit or how can my mission-aligned organization be part of this, please put that information in the survey. There's open-ended questions in our survey. Please put your contact information. We would love to create a list of people that we want to notify when opportunities become available. Another question about where you can find these properties. It is again available on our website. If you go to nolapublicschools.com, community facility planning, you will see all the information available there. Just reading the next question. This is an inquiry about 99-year leases for $1 for nonprofits or any low-cost nonprofits, especially for those that are minority-led, and giving preference to those led by people born and raised in New Orleans and educated in New Orleans public schools. I hope that you put that in our feedback surveys. We'll also be able to capture all of the questions here. I think those are the ideas that we're really interested in as we think about how do we prioritize who can maybe access short-term leases for mission-aligned organizations, really interested in people's feedback on how we create some priorities around that. And I think thinking about minority-led organizations and those who are native New Orleanians or have been serving this area for a long time is a really important characteristic to those priorities potentially. And another question is, could a community youth center be an option? Absolutely. Absolutely it could. I think we're also thinking about recreational spaces. Most community youth centers are run by nonprofits, so we kind of use the term nonprofit mission aligned organizations loosely, but that's exactly who we're hoping to serve, is to create spaces for our kids to go and receive enrichment spaces, services, and extracurricular activities. So I think that's a wonderful idea and absolutely should be prioritized. And for those of you who are probably had your question answered, I do want to thank you for joining tonight. Especially if any of you had also joined any of our public meetings. We've had about 100 people participate in this process, and we're very thankful for that. We've received a lot of great feedback and lots of considerations on how we make good decisions about community benefits and how do we define community. I'm going to stay on for a few more minutes to see if anybody has any other lingering questions. But for those who have had your question answered or you don't have any other questions, thank you for joining. Please scan that QR code. We really do want to hear from you, especially if you are a nonprofit provider or service provider to students and families in any way. We would love to get your contact information to build a list of those organizations who are interested in working with us. So please take that opportunity, and I will stay on for another 5 minutes to answer any questions. Mark, I hope I just answered your next steps question. Okay, I'm going to stay on for 1 more minute because we haven't had any new questions yet since then. And if you've got any other burning questions, please put them in soon. If not, thank you again for spending your evening with us on a Thursday. We really appreciate it. All right. Thank you guys again very much. Last opportunity to scan our QR code to submit your feedback and any questions or your contact information if you're interested in being part of this process as a partner who may help us in redevelopment of some of these facilities. We thank you again and hope to hear from you in the future. So everybody have a great night.